was that excessive optimism for people who saw that in 2013, or as in it's a technical issue and an engineering issue, or are there human issues that are involved in seemingly treading water to going back since 2013?
Sal, I'm probably not necessarily the best to answer that question. I just will say that some of the inspiration, going back to the first question about answering why we wrote the article, what brought us to write, was seeing the capabilities in JUCAS and the X-45 initially, and what it had to provide and offer, and the same in terms of the operating area that Trevor and I were in at the time when we decided to start writing. The challenges that we were met with on a daily basis in our mission planning cells to counter the threat that we were observing, and then reading about these capabilities that DARPA had produced and had actually fielded and demonstrated, and then that bridging that gap of producing that technology, demonstrating its capability, but then that the technology transition through that valley of death that is so often talked about in relation to DARPA's technologies that it fields, and then wondering why that capability is still lacking. Having been introduced to the MQ-25 program back in 2015 when I was at Nautic, and hearing some of the capabilities that it could have had in open source, and then seeing ultimately what is now being fielded, but again, not fielded for some time yet. So the capabilities that it could have or now will have are still lacking in our air wings going now towards, upwards of 2025, 2027, and continuing now, obviously, with the F-35, the capabilities it brings, but in terms of the unmanned aerial systems piece, not really incorporating that. And then the way that we field it now with warrant officers, aviation warrant officers in that program, and seeing how those will now be under the aviation command and logistics wing, the representation that'll have both in the command and control structure, but as well going forward, that advocacy in the Chief Naval Operations directorates, and going forward with folks that could assume admiral level leadership to bring that capability again from now where it's at in terms of an aerial fleeing platform, further that to now where we need to be, placing it into those mission planning cell processes of how do we combat these anti-access aerial denial capabilities when manned aircraft, just the longevity that we have for whether it be a flying mission, overall continued number of sorties over multiple event factors or multiple days just isn't where we need. I think Colonel Spataro could probably talk more to in terms of the human aspect there and the overall acquisitions capability quite a bit more, and then Trevor more so for the artificial intelligence piece of how we go forward with that.
Yeah, that's, I think something that highlighted, go ahead.
You got it, sir.
Yeah, I was just talking about, I wanted to dive into that culture piece a little bit, because those lead to very deliberate decisions. So, what Kramer was talking about there is that the decision for the operators of the airplane was for the MQ-25, the decision is for warrant officers. And so without developing and investing in the people that will become the future leaders, in this case, there won't be future admirals that come from that community and really understand what remote aviation and edge compute looks like and the direction that we're going. Because and part of this cultural piece that I found really interesting, especially as a former commander myself, is the very thing that makes us so good at making a mission operational squadron, that combat effective capability that we can put forward, is the very culture, in getting reps and sets and being very deliberate about mission planning and briefing, execution, and thorough debriefing. That very activity that develops our weapons and tactics instructors and populates our schoolhouses and allows us to meet our mission essential tasks, that very deliberate culture is the very thing that makes us kind of insulated and makes it difficult to break through when new capabilities are going to disrupt that mental model. It's really hard to make that paradigm shift. So that I found very fascinating as we're writing this article and digging deeper into the cultural issues.
And if I could kind of just jump in, like one of the important things that we seem to be lacking in terms of integrating unmanned aerial systems into carrier aviation is the iteration part, which you alluded to earlier, Sal. Like, there's only so much you're going to learn in a laboratory, and there's only so much trust. And I think that's another key aspect of this trust. People don't trust the system because with things like autonomy, artificial intelligence, those aspects are not in people's lexicon to include the U.S. military quite yet, or at least not as robust as we need to have it be. And so in order to build that trust, we have to have iteration. And just like you wouldn't expect a new guy or a new pilot to be proficient, we can't necessarily expect nascent technologies to be perfect out the door. So one of the things I would like to bring up is like JUCAS 2003 timeframe. X-47 was canceled, I believe, sometime in 2015 or 2017. And now we're into 2022. So the first U.S. carrier, USS Langley, 1922, and then we have full-fledged carrier air wings and developed tactics by the start of World War II. And how did we get there? We got there through iteration. That the fleet problems, like first fleet problem 9, that was the first time where we had maneuvers with fleet carriers and with a Panama Canal scenario. That's where they really kind of started to see, okay, what's the naval aviation bring us? Where is it deficient? Specifically, it's planes at the time did not have the range, the payload, or the endurance that commanders would like. But that didn't necessarily stop it, but that led you with further iteration and more improved designs, which we eventually had by the start of World War II. And then at that point, the lessons that we learned during World War II further created better and better platforms. So by the war, we had a very dominant air wing that was highly effective. Now, how we got there is the carrier aviation in general was very much in the public spotlight. And I don't think that necessarily is the case right now with unmanned autonomy and, kind of tangentially to that, artificial intelligence. It's not so much in the public form, and that's kind of to our detriment because, back in 1919, the predecessor naval aviation was almost disbanded by the Navy. But the external factors to that was at the time you had Billy Mitchell, who was a very flamboyant and outgoing character of the what was then the Air Service, which was part of the U.S. Army, which later became the U.S. Army Air Corps, and then eventually U.S. Air Force. He was a very outspoken proponent of aviation, to include the fact that he believed that all air power should fall under one service. And he also said that coastal defense, which was primarily a naval mission at the time, which should also fall under aircraft, and that navies were essentially obsolete. And so Billy Mitchell having the outside influence that he did with both Congress and the American public kind of forced the Navy to continue to pursue naval aviation.
Yeah, I'm glad one of you mentioned trust, because my older son just spent a few years as the requirements officer on OPNAV 98 air warfare, especially dealing with UASs Group 3 and below. And a lot of what he was doing was driven by the demand of his customers, and as they grew more experienced using these smaller unmanned aircraft, their trust and their interest in having more competent machinery to work with became stronger and stronger. So the question is that, and he wrote a pretty good paper on this, and actually its paper topic is, when he was at the Naval War College, is about exactly that topic, about trust and the gap that's between when you have a technology that's new and being introduced, and when it finally earns the trust and awareness of its limitations and capabilities that allows a wider adoption of its of its service. Now, if, and I think that one of the points of your paper is that if the senior level people are intentionally, or maybe not as intentional as the more paranoid among us would think, but are not trusting these larger unmanned systems because they don't have experience with them, but then they don't let anybody get experience with them. This seems like a do loop to me, where it's never going to move on, and yet we have people like you three who have researched this, and Colonel, you actually worked with the systems. How do we get your voices up the food chain to earn that trust and understanding at the higher levels? Are they just, are their ears completely blocked, or is there someone up there going, we really need to take a hard look at this, other than a few congressmen?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump on that to start. So trust is a fantastic topic, and I spent quite a bit of time looking at trust and autonomous systems at the Cyber War College last year, and trust is one of these things, and this is a quote, and I can't attribute it right off the top of my head. There's a book I was just reading recently, but it's gained in teaspoons but lost in buckets. And that quote, I just thought, really explains very well this challenge that we have right now, because as Mrs. was talking about earlier, there's a lot of these capabilities, and especially when we talk about narrow AI, and particularly if it's self-trained, like the Alpha Dogfight, one of those agents was, and actually the one that won. The explainability of an action can be very disconcerting if it doesn't go the way that you expect it. And so this trust challenge is really important. But if you separate the things that have to be developed, to very high engineering standards that we see in normal aviation and submarines and ships and these really complex systems, typically it's 10 to the minus ninth is the level of certainty that you need that something is not going to catastrophically fall apart. That's different for things like flight control systems, where your outputs need to be very precise. They need to be known knowns, safety systems, as opposed to mission systems where you can have different algorithms or different components and sensors that can work together to give you varying probability of outputs. And there's a point where then you can compare human performance to a system's performance. And I think what we'll find is there's a lot of low risk, high payoff areas if we're able to dive down that thought path a little bit deeper and do deliberate experimentation. And Carrier Aviation is an important place to do that, where we find where can unmanned systems and edge computing, artificial intelligence, where can these capabilities best complement the human? This isn't a competition. This is about survivability, lethality, force projection when needed. And so I think that's a really important thought about trust and how do you gain it in these teaspoons over time. Well, it's not just going to magically happen. It takes investments in education.
If I also may add in there real quick, I don't know if anyone saw the article in the New Yorker recently on the 17th of January, but the rise of AI fighter pilots, artificial intelligence is being taught to fly warplanes. Can the technology be trusted? Fantastic article that wraps up, all of DARPA's, involvement in the field, Alpha Dogfight included, but then also trying to measure that inherent trust and the emotional response from humans, and seeing how often when actually the technology would have produced a favorable outcome, humans intervening, and because they just didn't feel like things were going right. But again, more of an emotional response by the actual algorithmic approach that the technology was using, which would have achieved in their modeling a more superior outcome. And I think it's a fantastic, topic, especially the mitigation of human error, and in terms of what we perceive the technology itself would result in. Whereas, the mitigation of human error is a huge a component that in certain areas